Ooh, ooh. Search your heart, search your soul. When you find me there, you will search no more. I can't tell you, there's nothing I want more. I can't tell you, it's not worth fighting for. You know it's true, of everything I do it for you. Doom, 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 doom. Bow, 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 bow. I'd fight for you, I'd lie for you, walk the while for you, yeah, I'd die for you. You know it's true, everything I do it for you. Yeah. Hello again, Internet. It is I, StarScream, the ruler of the galaxy. And I'm back, and I have one question. Just one, but it's pretty good. And I'm going to actually ramble a bit here. I think that's better if I do. Even though it's crazy, but, or at least the thoughts in my head are crazy. I start rampantly thinking about many things. Anyway, today's question comes from Jed Vargo, and he's on Facebook, on my Facebook page, and he says, we had a good question on the podcast. He's on a podcast called Blackout and Shout, and he said the question was from a character named Deluxe, and he said this past episode, the question that was posed to them, which he's forwarded to me, the question is, if you could go back in time for 1 week, where and when would it be and what would you do? Well, I'd like to say that silly people often make this question or suggest this sort of question as a scenario, but the question is often a method of saying what kind of interesting part of history would you like to see, or it's about something that you want to pull off that's like, you know, you could go back in time and murder someone and commit a crime and escape and go back into the future and change things and that kind of thing, or make yourself rich. Make yourself crazy rich. And I would say that some people who are a little bit smarter about this question will put stipulations on the question. They'll say, you know, to be really clear, that you can't bring any objects back with you into the future, and you're not invisible, so whatever you do might harm you. You go back to a dangerous period of time and you get killed, well, you're done. Or they might say that you are invisible, and so you can't touch anything, you can't affect anything in the past, and all you can do is observe the past, whatever those stipulations might be. But I think you could actually cover both areas of interest if you went back far enough in time to something that is not known about history. And what I think people would often make the mistake about is saying, well, here's this piece of known history. I'd like to go back and see what really happened, you know, see how did the Romans really conquer the Celts. There's descriptions from Roman generals that look like something from Conan the Barbarian, where it's just like these giant naked Celts with blonde hair flowing and huge muscles, and they would pick up trees and crush a man with with their hands, and and their women were mighty. Anyway, I'm curious how the Romans could have ever possibly caused a Celtic Holocaust, but it's interesting. But I don't think you need to see that because it happened, therefore you know it happened, and if it happened, then why would you need to see it, and what difference would it make to you in the future or to anybody else in the future? Or if you could affect that scenario, could you stop it from happening? And since this is only a particular question of existentialism, then it really doesn't matter what you think might change because it's just a question. Well, I think the answer to this question is to go somewhere in the past that is not known to history, and where we start to lose history, I mean really effectively lose history. You have to go back a few thousand years before even the suggestion of known language or written language. You'd have to go back pretty far. And there's also a lot of things about history that have been covered up or changed, false history that's been given to us by the academic elite of mostly European academic halls, where they've changed a lot of things in history, a lot of things that didn't fit their narrative that they teach in school. And the greatest cover-up that we know is a conspiracy, 100 times that of JFK, would probably be the butchering of the people at Montsegur, which was Montsegur was castle monastery they completely destroyed, and the village and everybody and the farmers and all the people that lived in the village. And I think it was the archbishop or whoever who said the famous line, "Kill them all." These Cathars or whoever was there, and they said, "Kill them all. God will know His own." It's almost a Metallica album. But yeah, that'd be something to know. Like, what was in that castle? I mean, they killed everybody. They must have wanted something in that castle. Something the Vatican knows. And they've also got thousands of items in the Smithsonian vault that are labeled as out of place or unconforming objects, or simply unknown to what period they belong. I think to answer this question of traveling back in time, you could functionally answer the question by looking at all the items in the Smithsonian and making it public, making it open source, allowing people to actually study what's in those vaults. I bet there's a lot of people who'd like to know what's in those Smithsonian vaults. If you were careful and didn't damage anything. I think if you tore apart the pyramid, the Great Pyramid, you might discover some stuff. You know what, I'd like to talk about the pyramid for a second. There's a big question in history that is unknown, and it would be about these great megalithic sites in the world and when they were built, because it would seem that there's only one historical marker of interest, and that is the great flood of the what they call the glacial maximum. And it was about 12,800 years ago. There was a massive flood. They think it was possibly a meteorite or a solar flare, and a huge flood, and it carved out the landscape, and it killed thousands of animals and leveled all of Canada and most of North America. Got wiped out, and it carved out the Grand Canyon, and it was a huge 7-mile high water and ice and mud and boulders. And it's what all the great flood myths are all about, Atlantis and Noah, which is really Gilgamesh, and these old flood myths. And anyways, the question would be whether or not a lot of the old megalithic sites were built after the flood or before the flood. I would suggest that they were probably built after the flood, because it seems to me that there was a civilization, a great civilization that existed, that was somewhat obsessed with building structures out of massive stone blocks. They may even have had a really good geopolymer, or what you might call a cement, a way of molding blocks far superior to what we do now. And they may have even had the ability to grow stones. If you want to get into this, there used to be giant mushrooms that turned into more of a silicone than a carbon, and as well there's a lot of petrified, the petrified forest that's crystals, and the petrified frogs, and what were they, sea creatures, that turned into stone rather than dissolving, which is, you bury your cat, it doesn't turn to stone, it turns into ash and dirt in the ground. And that there was some point in time in the past when things tended to decay into more of a silicone base and turned into rock or crystal, rather than dissolving, and that there may have been a period of time when a civilization knew how to mold these decaying, you might call it mushroom-like rock or mycelium growth, that would decay into stone, and they knew how to mold it. I'm rambling, aren't I? Yeah, I'm rambling. I love it. So there's a lot of great sites around the world, and I like to talk about the pyramids. Did you know that if you poured water in the side of the pyramid, it goes down into the lower chamber, and it would then evaporate, and if you could seal off the entranceway, which is not the tunnel that the pirates dug, that's not the entranceway, but if you poured water into the entranceway and you blocked it off, then the water evaporated and turned into these lighter gases like hydrogen. The gas would go up into the upper chamber, which they call the king's chamber, and in there's stacked stones above the roof that are a lot like a capacitor, that if you added a small spark to that environment would cause an explosion. And the walls in there were black like an oven when they were first looked at by French and German archaeologists, who probably weren't the first people to be in there, but they supposedly broke away the stones that sealed off that room, or somewhat sealed off the room. I think there was a lot of stones just there to sort of keep the flow of, or the backflow of condensation, because you'd have a certain amount of water coming back through the system, which is what the Grand Gallery is all about. The Grand Gallery would collect a lot of condensation of water. In fact, it has a lot of lime damage on it when it was discovered, and some of the water would flow back through the system. And so basically, as a great monument to science, the pyramid is aligned with the stars, it's aligned geographically, it's mathematically and geometrically balanced within a certain scale of the Earth's diameter, and it's also a monument to chemistry from the land of Kamut. And it turned water into fire. And that's not something that I think would be a huge mystery, but what is a mystery is what is going on with the middle chamber, what they call the Queen's Chamber, because it seems to have some completely separate function, that even if you could establish that the pyramid was built to turn water into fire, well, what is the middle chamber all about? Well, what happened in there? And there's little bowling ball corridors that don't seem to go anywhere, but they drop down inside to other chambers. Anyways, I think if you dug the pyramid apart brick by brick, you could figure out what other chambers are in there. You're not going to find Khufu in there. I'm just letting you know. I'm letting all those Egyptologists know. You're not going to find the grave of Khufu by digging holes in the pyramid. You might collapse the structure. It might fall down and be quite chaotic, and who knows if you could ever build it back again to its greatness and damage one of the monumental historical structures of the earth. Who cares? We need to know. But there's a lot of megalithic sites around the world, like Sacsayhuaman in Peru, where there's a huge protective wall of giant stones, and there's also temples there that we don't know how old they are, and places like the Aksum Temple, which is far more recent. It looks like a giant iron cross. There's what am I thinking of? The city of and Göbekli Tepe is an interesting site that's been shut down, and a really, really old stone pyramid that's now a hill at Gunung Padang. I'd really love to go back in time and see when that was built, how old it is. That's really the question. How old is that thing? You know, it's basically being retaken by the hill. It's a really old site. You know, and there's some really old what you might call wells, or almost like baptismal fonts, but sort of ancient well holes that are all over Africa and different regions. Certainly Africa, where it hasn't been settled, where there's unpopulated areas, you find these old structures that were built by some civilization thousands of years ago. And again, the question would be, was this stuff built before or after the flood? Because maybe, and I think that the civilization that survived the Great Flood, they became obsessed with building structures that wouldn't come down if the earth shook and there was dry lightning and there was rain, unendless rain, and water flooding everywhere. I think that James Cameron should take that submarine of his and go look around the coastal areas that went underwater during that flood, because a lot of land went underwater, and I'll bet that's where all the coastal cities used to be. That's what the real story of Atlantis is. And, you know, I'd like to go back in time and see some ancient sites. And as for going back in time and making money, or getting away with some grand, some grand scheme, and I'm not that devious, I wouldn't want to go back in time and kill anybody, but the question of going back in time so that you could make money and, you know, come back wealthy, even if you couldn't bring anything with you, imagine if you went back in time and you discovered the secrets of history that people don't know, that we've lost from our past, and knowing exactly what happened in the ancient past. I mean, you could just write a book about it and make millions. I mean, just coming back from the past and saying, well, I know when the pyramids were really built, and it wasn't 4,000 years ago, it was 40,000 years ago. You know, that kind of thing is very interesting. And what was I going to say? I was going to say there's a site. There's one site that I think if I had to pick one site above any other to go back in time and discover why was it built, who built it, what really happened, I think it would have to be a site in the district of Changjing by the city of Jinan in the Shandong province by the LOC. That's south of a town called Dugud, I think that's how I'm pronouncing it. And what's there is what you might call a double Rushan. I must know, why would you build giant tits in the middle of China? Why? I should go to bed. You know, I think that answers your question, Jed. And I'm trying to, you know, think what else I would say about the past. I think the past is very interesting. You know, I'd like to know if some ancient civilization knew how to mold stones that were soft at one point in time because they were decaying from some method of silicone decay that we're not aware of anymore, because nothing does that anymore. All of our trees turn into dirt. They don't turn into petrified crystals, you know? It doesn't seem to happen anymore. And it would be interesting to know if maybe these ancients knew how to mold stone, because it's pretty hard to believe that they knew how to lift stones that were 20 tons or 100 tons or 1,000 tons. How do you lift something like that? I mean, the Romans definitely didn't do it. You know, how about the Moai on Easter Island? You know, I mean, those are standing stones, and there's actually a lot of standing stones around the world, and those are not that easy to move, but you can move them without even levers. You just sort of have to use leverage, and if you teeter them back and forth enough, and you have a plot in the ground, then you can levy the stone until it can be turned high enough on its axis. Kind of like, I don't know, kind of like building a Jenga tower before it falls down. But you know, there's great questions about the past and what happened in our history that we've lost. And just knowing that you could come back to the future and tell everyone the answers, and they would love you for it, you know. It's not really something devious. It's something good. It's something that we need to know, and we need to study as much as we can and find out what's under the water from the Great Flood. We need to learn what's under the ground from so far in the past that the earth has reclaimed the land. They haven't even dug on the city of Ramesses, you know. They just shut it down. Someone goes in there like, hey, let's dig this up, and the government says, no, don't dig that up. Why? We should dig it up. We should find out where and when and how, and we'd know everything. Wouldn't it be good to know everything? Oh, that's right. I've already said that. I do know everything, don't I? I think. Hate to contradict myself, but, you know, basically the answer to your question, Jed. What else could I say? I guess you could talk about money. What's money worth? You know, well, what would you do if you had all kinds of money would be a good question. But maybe that's another question for another time. I certainly don't have a lot of money. But one day, and in the meantime, I am going to continue ruling the galaxy and making you all jealous. So I hope that answers your question. And how do I end this? Well, I don't know. You tell me. You tell me what you want me to do. Do you want me to come up with a better format for these things? Do you want me to do some other kind of, maybe I could do the news. StarScream does the news. Maybe. Do something like Stefan Molyneux, who just like rants because he's a stay-at-home dad, so he has nothing but time on his hand, and he's brilliant. So he just sits there and makes these videos all about everything. Maybe I could do that. Who knows? I'll leave it up to you, Internet. If you continue to ask me questions, I will continue to answer them. For now, we're done. Whatever. Yeah. Yeah. It's all these forest fires in California. We need to pump up the federal spending. Get to the chopper! The chopper! Hurry! Look at my muscles. I am a superior human being. Yeah, well, that's it.